Have you ever felt like you're losing the respect of your children? You've spent your whole life raising them, sacrificing for them, guiding them. But one day, you realize something has changed. Maybe they talk down to you, maybe they don't listen to your advice, or worse, they make you feel like a burden. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. But instead of getting angry or feeling frustrated, there's another way to regain their respect without arguments or resentment. In this video, I'm going to share 6 simple yet powerful actions that can help you shift the dynamic and earn back your place as a respected figure in your children's lives. Stick around until the end. You might be surprised by the changes these actions can bring. There comes a time in every parent's life when the roles start to shift. You've spent years raising your children, guiding them, putting their needs before your own, and sacrificing in ways that only a parent truly understands. But then, one day, it hits you. Something has changed. Maybe your kids dismiss your advice, maybe they talk over you, or worse, they start treating you like a burden. You've spent decades trying to raise them right, but now it feels like you're the one being ignored. It's painful, it's frustrating, and it can leave you feeling lost and questioning everything you've done for them. I remember meeting a woman named Sandra. She was a strong, independent woman when she was younger, determined to make a good life for herself and her kids. But as the years went by, Sandra started to change. She began to adjust her entire life around her children. She rearranged her schedule to accommodate their needs, always said yes when she really wanted to say no, and kept her own opinions to herself, hoping to keep the peace. "I just want to keep the family together," she once told me. But instead of bringing her closer to her children, all this sacrifice began to push them away. Her kids stopped respecting her. They saw her as someone who would always bend over backward for them, always agree with them, and always keep quiet. Sandra thought she was keeping the peace by doing everything they wanted, but in reality, she was losing her voice. She became invisible in her own family. If you find yourself in Sandra's shoes, the first thing you need to understand is this: respect isn't earned through self-sacrifice. It's earned through self-respect. When you're constantly trying to please your children, putting their needs ahead of your own, you're teaching them that your feelings and needs don't matter. And when they start to believe that, it's easy for them to take you for granted. The key here is simple but powerful. Stop chasing their approval. This doesn't mean you stop loving or supporting them. It simply means that you stop sacrificing yourself in the process. Set boundaries. Say no when you need to. Speak your mind, even if they don't like what you have to say. The moment you start respecting yourself, your children will start seeing you differently. And in time, the respect you deserve will follow. When your children start dismissing your opinions or treating you with disrespect, it's natural to feel the urge to argue. You may want to remind them of everything you've done for them, of all the sacrifices you've made, or of the wisdom you've accumulated over the years. You may feel like you need to prove that you still deserve their respect, that you're still relevant in their lives. But let me tell you something that could save you years of frustration. Arguing doesn't work. Think about it. When was the last time you convinced someone to respect you by fighting for it? Arguing only feeds into a cycle of tension and resentment. Instead of gaining respect, all you're doing is giving them more power over you. I once knew a man named William. He had spent his life as a teacher, commanding respect in the classroom with calm authority and wisdom. But at home, things were different. His grown children started treating him like an afterthought. They ignored his advice, dismissed his concerns, and sometimes even laughed when he tried to offer a suggestion. At first, William tried to argue. He reminded them of the years he spent guiding them, of the lessons he had taught them, and of how much he had sacrificed. But the more he fought, the worse things became. Then, one day, William decided to make a change. Instead of arguing, he chose to lead by example. He stopped chasing their approval and started listening, really listening, to his children. He stopped speaking out of frustration or trying to convince them of his point of view. Instead, he spoke calmly, with wisdom, and without the need to win the conversation. What happened next was remarkable. Slowly, his children began to notice the shift. They saw a man who wasn't desperate for their approval, who wasn't trying to fight for respect. Instead, he was a man who carried himself with dignity. He was a father who spoke with confidence, who valued himself enough not to argue or beg for their attention. If your children aren't respecting you, don't fight them for it. Show them what respect looks like by the way you carry yourself. Lead by example. Keep your dignity intact. Speak with confidence. And most importantly, never lower yourself to their level. Because when you hold your ground with grace, they will feel it. And in time, they'll start to respect you, not because you demanded it, but because you earned it by showing them what respect truly looks like. One of the toughest lessons to learn as we grow older is that we can't rely on our children for emotional fulfillment. As parents, it's natural to love our children deeply and hope that they love and respect us in return. But sometimes, without realizing it, we place so much emotional weight on them that it starts to affect the relationship. When they sense that you need them for validation or affection, the power dynamic shifts, and things can quickly become strained. Let me tell you about a woman named Elizabeth. Elizabeth was a kind, loving mother who had always given her children everything she had, emotionally, physically, and mentally. But as they got older and began living their own lives, Elizabeth found herself feeling lonely and neglected. She waited by the phone, hoping for a call from one of her kids. When the calls didn't come, she'd pick up the phone and dial their number, often leaving long messages about how much she missed them and wished they would visit more often. But instead of drawing them closer, this behavior pushed them away. Her children began seeing her calls as an obligation rather than a pleasure. They didn't look forward to her reaching out. They felt burdened by it. And in turn, they started pulling back even more, becoming more impatient and distant. One day, Elizabeth had a realization. She stopped waiting by the phone. She stopped calling first. Instead, she decided to focus on her own life. She joined a local book club, started taking weekend trips with friends, and found new hobbies that made her feel fulfilled. To her surprise, something amazing happened. Her children began calling more. They started respecting her time. They saw her as someone with a full life of her own, not someone who was just waiting for their attention. The lesson here is simple. The less emotionally dependent you are on your children, the more they will respect and appreciate you. When you show them that you're not waiting around for their validation, they will begin to value your presence more. They'll see you as someone who has their own life, who stands strong on their own, and who isn't emotionally reliant on them for happiness. And that kind of independence is not only respected, it's admired. So, if you find yourself waiting for your children to call, visit, or pay attention to you, take a step back. Focus on yourself. Discover your passions, make time for your own happiness, and let your children see that you have a life outside of them. You'll be surprised at how much more they'll respect and appreciate you. One of the most common reasons children start losing respect for their parents is because the parents allow it. It's easy to let things slide, to stay quiet when your children interrupt you, dismiss your opinions, or treat you as though your time and feelings don't matter. But here's the truth. If you allow this behavior, it will continue. Not because your children are bad people, but because, like anyone, they will treat you the way you allow them to. I once met a man named Richard. Richard was a retired businessman who had spent decades managing a company with discipline and respect. He was used to commanding attention and being listened to. But when it came to his adult children, things were different. They interrupted him when he spoke, dismissed his concerns as irrelevant, and even criticized the way he chose to live his life in his retirement. At first, Richard tried to brush it off, telling himself that it wasn't worth the fight. After all, they were his children. He didn't want to cause tension. But over time, he began to realize that every time he stayed silent, every time he let them talk over him or belittle his opinions, he was teaching them that their behavior was acceptable. He was allowing them to disrespect him, and in doing so, he was losing his own dignity. So, one day, Richard made a change. When his son interrupted him, he calmly said, "I'll continue speaking when you're ready to listen." When his daughter dismissed his opinion, he simply responded, "You don't have to agree with me, but I expect you to respect me." And when they continued to push his boundaries, he made it clear, "If you can't treat me with basic respect, I won't be spending time with you." At first, his children were shocked. They didn't understand why their father, who had always been so easygoing, was suddenly setting these limits. But over time, something incredible happened. They began to listen. They saw that Richard wasn't backing down, that he valued himself enough to demand respect. They realized that he wouldn't tolerate being treated like an afterthought. And as a result, they started respecting him again. If your children don't respect you, it's time to ask yourself, are you allowing it? Have you been letting them interrupt you, dismiss your opinions, or take your time for granted? If so, it's time to set boundaries. Setting boundaries doesn't mean cutting your children off or starting a fight. It simply means deciding what kind of behavior you will and won't tolerate, and then enforcing those limits. It's about showing your children that you value yourself enough to demand respect. When you do this, you'll be surprised at how quickly they start to respect you again. As parents, we often give, whether it's our time, our energy, or our support, even when it's not acknowledged. We want to help our children, and we love them, so we give and give. But there's a problem. When you constantly give without receiving appreciation, you're not building respect or love. You're building entitlement. I remember a man named Joseph. Joseph was a generous father. He was always there for his children, no matter what they needed. If they called for help, he'd drop everything. If they needed money, he'd provide it. He rearranged his life to accommodate their needs, always willing to sacrifice for their happiness. But instead of gratitude, Joseph was met with complaints. They didn't thank him for his help. They expected more. And when Joseph finally needed help, when he asked his children for something in return, they were too busy. It was a heartbreaking realization for Joseph. He had spent years giving his all to his children, but they had stopped valuing his generosity. They no longer saw it as a gift. They saw it as something they were entitled to. It wasn't until Joseph made a change that things began to shift. He stopped overextending himself. He stopped offering help before it was even asked. And, most importantly, he began saying no when he needed to. At first, his children were frustrated. They didn't understand why their father was suddenly pulling back. They were used to him being available at a moment's notice. But over time, they began to realize something. Joseph's generosity wasn't unlimited. His time and energy were valuable. They started to appreciate his efforts more because, suddenly, they realized it wasn't a given. The key takeaway here is this. When you give without appreciation, you build expectation, not respect. If you're constantly giving and your children are taking it for granted, it's time to reevaluate. Ask yourself, are you giving more than you should? And if you stopped giving, what would happen? Would your children start to appreciate what you've done for them? Teaching your children that your generosity is conditional on respect isn't being selfish. It's teaching them how to value you. And when you stop giving without appreciation, you'll find that they begin to treat your time and your kindness with the respect it deserves. One of the most powerful ways to regain your children's respect is to show them that your happiness doesn't revolve around them. As parents, it's natural to devote ourselves entirely to our children. We put them at the center of our world, and we believe that if we give them everything, they'll be happy and successful. But as we get older, that dynamic begins to shift. And if we've spent our entire lives prioritizing them, they may start to see us as people with nothing else going on. Let me tell you about a woman named Claire. Claire was a widow in her late 70s. After losing her husband, she dedicated all her energy to her children. She called them constantly, gave them unsolicited advice, and expected them to fill the emotional void her husband had left behind. But instead of growing closer, her relationship with her children became strained. They started visiting less, and when they did visit, the calls were shorter and more distant. Claire felt more alone than ever. Then one day, Claire decided to make a change. She stopped making her children the center of her world. She joined a local book club, started volunteering at a community center, and even began taking weekend trips with friends. She found new passions and rediscovered a sense of purpose outside of her children. To her surprise, her relationship with her children began to change. They started reaching out more. They were curious about what she was doing, and they began to admire her independence. They respected her in a way they hadn't before. The lesson here is simple. People respect those who have their own purpose, their own sense of fulfillment, and their own joy. If you've spent your entire life prioritizing your children, ask yourself, do they see you as someone with a full, meaningful life? Or do they see you as someone waiting for their attention? When you show your children that you are living, not just existing, they'll begin to see you in a completely different light. It's not about neglecting your children or being selfish. It's about teaching them that you're a person too, with your own passions, goals, and sense of happiness. When they see that you are fulfilled on your own, they will respect you more, and they'll start to appreciate your presence, not because you're dependent on them, but because you've built a life of your own. Respect isn't something you can demand from your children. It's something you inspire through the way you carry yourself, through the boundaries you set, and through the life you lead. If they've started treating you with less care, less consideration, or less respect, don't waste your energy getting angry. Instead, shift your approach. Stop chasing their approval because the less you need it, the more they'll give it. Lead by example, because your dignity speaks louder than your words. Withdraw your emotional dependence, because the more self-sufficient you are, the more they'll respect your presence. Set boundaries, because people will only treat you as well as you require them to. Stop giving without appreciation, because when generosity is taken for granted, it loses its value. And most importantly, build a life outside of them, because people respect those who have their own purpose, joy, and sense of fulfillment. If you do these things, something incredible will happen. Your children will start seeing you in a different light, not as someone waiting for their attention, but as someone who commands respect simply by being who you are. And in time, that respect will come back to you, not because you demanded it, but because you earned it.